The women who had eaten from Ifeoma's hand for 7 harvests took her arms, turned her stool upside down, and left her standing like a stranger beside her own husband's fire. Red dust clung to the hem of her indigo wrapper, and wood smoke entered her eyes, but she did not bow her head. Nneka lifted the blackened pot while the elders watched, and nobody offered Ifeoma another place to sit. "Let the fire show us what this woman has been feeding my brother." Nneka poured the food before the ceremonial flame. Obinna stood beside the elders, opened his mouth once, closed it, then called, "Ifeoma, answer her." He did not say, "My wife." My people, a name can become a slap when love removes its hand. The fire reached for the food, bent low and drew away. Ifeoma did not move, but her shadow crossed the red earth and wrapped itself around Obinna's feet. Behind him, another darkness rose where no person stood. The women released Ifeoma. One lamp died, then another. Before that second darkness could touch Obinna's back, the night broke apart and the telling returned to 3 market days before the harvest fire called her shadow out. Ifeoma was still beside the evening pot then, waiting for a husband who had begun to fear the food keeping him alive. She took bitter leaves, crushed them small, added roasted seed and poured in water drawn before first cockcrow. Ada sat on the low stool and sang under her breath, "Eat before the fear sleeps, let the faithful shadow stand." Ifeoma touched one finger to her lips. Nneka entered without calling from the path. She came straight into the shelter, took the ladle from Ifeoma's hand with her left hand and lifted it towards her nose. "Ah, my brother's wife, since when does a harmless soup need secrets?" Ifeoma held out her palm. "Sister, return what you took from my cooking place." Nneka did not return it. She looked instead towards the yard where Obinna's footsteps were approaching. Obinna entered with red dust on his ankles and the tired bend of a man who had followed a hoe since morning. "You have returned well," Ifeoma told him. Nneka answered before he could. She brought another bowl from the main kitchen and placed it in his hands. "My brother, eat this one. Let your stomach rest from hidden leaves." Obinna looked at Ifeoma, then lowered his eyes and ate from Nneka's bowl. Before the evening fire settled, the scar in Obinna's right palm burned dark beneath his skin. His breath shortened. He gripped the doorway, and the thin shadow under his feet pulled away from his heels by the width of 2 fingers. Ifeoma took one bitter leaf, went to him, pressed it beneath his tongue and held his jaw until he swallowed. His breathing eased. Nneka stared as if the cure itself had accused her. The next morning, Nneka carried the hidden leaf bundle to Mama Amara's veranda. She dropped it beside the kola tray and waited. Mama Amara smelled the leaves before she looked down. Her fingers stopped over the kola. One nut split into 4 crooked pieces, and the smallest piece rolled beneath her stool. Ada began the fire song again. Mama Amara caught the child's wrist so quickly that the brass bowl rang. "Stop that song!" Mama Amara's voice came out thin. Nneka leaned closer. "Mama, you know these leaves." Mama Amara gathered the pieces with shaking fingers. "It is well. I have never seen them." Ifeoma stood at the veranda edge and watched the older woman refuse her eyes. The same hand that had welcomed her into the household was now putting sand inside the pot. And who spoke for her that morning? Nobody. Keep your place beside this fire, because the next thing it remembers may tear this household open. Before the shadows shortened, Nneka had carried the leaf bundle through every doorway that would receive her, and each telling grew a new tooth. By the time Obinna returned from the yam ridge, People were no longer asking what Ifeoma had put into his food. They were asking how long she had been controlling him. Nneka stood before the locked cooking shelter and ordered Ifeoma to stop preparing Obinna's food until the elders examined every leaf. Now hear me. Ifeoma took back her ladle and held it against her chest. Sister, I will not leave my husband hungry because your fear has found a loud mouth. Nneka stepped closer. Who told you this cooking place belongs to you alone? Ifeoma did not move. If that evening pot goes cold, this compound may finish the harvest with one son fewer than it began. Obinna heard the warning from the yard. He came, took the ladle from Ifeoma, and asked why a loving wife would speak of her husband's death instead of telling the truth. Ifeoma looked at the scar in his palm. My husband, the food protects you. That is the part I am permitted to say. He laughed once, without joy. Permitted by whom? She could not answer. Because the covenant held her mouth, Obinna heard only the part that sounded like lying. That night, they sat on opposite sides of their sleeping room while the oil lamp burned between them. Ifeoma named the fever that left him during their first harvest, the night his palm burned during the second, and the season he returned from the fields unable to breathe. Obinna remembered each sickness. He did not remember the bitter leaf that ended it. 7 harvests, she told him. Do they weigh less than 3 market days of suspicion? Obinna reached towards the covered bowl beside her, then stopped when Nneka's leaf bundle crossed his mind. The lamp died without wind. Before dawn, Nneka entered the main kitchen, removed the final protected portion from Obinna's bowl, and carried it to the rare ash path. She poured it into cold ash, spilled salt from her left hand, and covered the white grains with her heel. Beyond the yam fields, a dog began crying towards the old grove. Ada came around the kitchen wall carrying a clay cup and saw Nneka returning from the ash path. The child noticed cold ash on her sandals, but not what had been poured there. Nneka bent, wiped the girl's cheek, and told her that Auntie Ifeoma had tried to feed Obinna after being forbidden. Ada looked towards the hidden path. The dog cried again, long and low, and Nneka's left wrist began to itch beneath its brass bracelet. By sunrise, Mama Amara's veranda had become a family court. The leaf bundle sat beside the kola tray, and the senior relatives spoke as if Ifeoma's guilt had arrived before she did. Nneka repeated the warning about one son fewer and called it a threat. Obinna stood with the wooden ladle in his hand. Ifeoma remained at the edge of the veranda until the eldest man touched kola to the earth and permitted the matter to open. When Mama Amara was asked whether she knew the leaves, she said no for the second time. Ifeoma did not raise her voice. Mama, look at me and say it again. The older woman lifted her eyes only halfway, then lowered them. Obinna asked Ifeoma to surrender the ladle until the harvest gathering. She refused to give it to Nneka. So Obinna took it himself, crossed the courtyard, and tied the cooking shelter shut before the gathered family in full silence. Ada hurried after him, caught her sandal at the threshold, and fell to one knee. The child looked back at Ifeoma before anyone helped her rise. Obinna hung the ladle on the outside peg where his wife could see it but not reach it. The hand that throws away the evening pot should not ask why hunger entered at night. Yet Obinna tightened the knot. One name only. Who will betray Ifeoma first? The locked door answered before the compound did. That afternoon, Mama Amara waited until the courtyard emptied. She entered her private room, lifted the edge of her sleeping mat, and drew out an old indigo cloth. A round burn mark sat at its center, like an eye that had forgotten how to close. Ada appeared in the doorway and asked whether it belonged to Auntie Ifeoma. "It belongs to a night nobody should remember," Mama Amara said. When Ada sang, "Eat before the fire sleeps," Mama Amara answered the next word before fear caught her mouth. Near sunset, Obinna collapsed inside the yam barn. His right palm burned against the timber post and his shadow dragged half a step behind him. Ifeoma heard the fall from the yard. The cooking shelter remained locked, so she pulled one bitter leaf from where she had hidden it inside her braided bun. She knelt, opened his mouth, and placed the leaf beneath his tongue. His breath returned before Nneka reached the doorway and saw Ifeoma's hand supporting his jaw. Nneka turned the rescue into another accusation. "You see, even after we stopped her, she still hides medicine on her body." Obinna could not deny that the leaf had helped him. Fear, however, had already found a stool in his chest. "Why hide it in your hair?" he asked. Ifeoma rose slowly and wiped dust from her knees. "Because a locked door does not remove hunger from a house." The dog cried again towards the old grove. The family carried Obinna back to the courtyard. Nneka demanded a public harvest fire test. If the fire accepted Ifeoma's food, she said, the household would apologize. If it refused the meal or revealed an unnatural sign, Ifeoma must leave before nightfall. The elders objected that ceremonial fire was not a broom for sweeping household jealousy. Mama Amara could have ended the matter with one sentence. She held it behind her teeth. Obinna agreed, saying, "My wife will stand before the elders." The words "my wife" remained in his mouth, but trust had already left them. One elder watched Nneka on one side and Ifeoma on the other. "A yam tied to two stakes will still fall if both stakes lean away." Nobody laughed. As the shadows lengthened, relatives arranged stools in a judgment circle, stacked firewood in the stone pit, and carried harvest baskets to the courtyard edge. Ifeoma watched her private sorrow becoming a place where strangers could sit. By harvest night, relatives, farm workers, and market women had filled the compound. Nneka ordered one of the women to remove Ifeoma's cooking stool. The woman lifted it without meeting her eyes. Mama Amara called her Ifeoma instead of "my wife." Nneka also abandoned "my brother's wife" and used the bare name. Each lost kinship word removed another wall from around Ifeoma, but she remained standing beside the meal they had forbidden her to explain. The elders placed Ifeoma before the ceremonial fire without a seat. Nneka stood close to Obinna and repeated that hidden ingredients had entered his body for 7 harvests. A market woman whispered that a wife who cooked after first cockcrow must be hiding more than hunger. Ifeoma heard every word. She looked towards Mama Amara, but the older woman studied the kola tray as if truth might remain buried beneath it. Obinna rested his right hand on the stool that should have belonged to his wife. Ifeoma will answer what has been brought against her. The courtyard became still. He had removed my wife before elders, relatives, and workers. Her marriage, honor, and recognized place had become public property. The covenant heard what the family pretended was only speech. Somewhere beyond the yam fields, the crying dog stopped for the length of one breath. Nneka unfolded a cloth and claimed it had wrapped the forbidden leaves. Before an elder could bring it to the flame, Papa Chidi called from outside the gate. "Is anybody at home?" He entered only after the elders answered. The old man greeted the council, accepted the kola, and asked why a household had called fire to answer a question its own mouths feared. Then he held out his long, kola-stained fingers for Nneka's cloth. Papa Chidi placed the cloth near the ceremonial flame. The fire leaned away from it and turned towards the burn scar beneath Nneka's bracelet. The cloth did not catch. Nneka pulled her wrist behind her back. Papa Chidi said, "The fire does not chase the innocent cloth. It waits for the hand that brought it." For the first time, Ifeoma's accusers had no quick answer. If your heart rose with hers, let your like stand beside her before the compound changes its mouth again. Papa Chidi turned from the untouched cloth and asked Obinna to show his right palm. The younger man hesitated, then opened his hand. The thin scar that had crossed it since childhood had darkened into a broken circle. Papa Chidi did not touch it. He leaned close enough for his clouded eye to catch the firelight, then asked whether the mark had burned before. Obinna remembered the yam barn, the first rejected meal, and every season when breath had nearly left him. "My son, when did you last eat from your wife's hand?" Papa Chidi asked. Nneka answered before Obinna could speak. The elder raised one kola-stained finger. A man's stomach should not need his sister to remember for it. Obinna said the last full meal had been the night before the cooking shelter was sealed. Papa Chidi looked towards the tied door, then opened the place where truth was locked outside and fear was given the key. Obinna crossed the courtyard and cut the fiber cord himself. Ada hurried after him, but stumbled at the same threshold where she had fallen when the shelter was first sealed. The wooden ladle dropped from its peg into the red dust. She reached for it. Ifeoma stopped her with one look. "Leave it, child. The hand that took it must decide whether it is ready to return it." Obinna lifted the ladle, but he could not place it in Ifeoma's palm. Inside the shelter, the covered clay bowl stood where Ifeoma had left it. Obinna removed the lid. The final protected portion was gone. Nneka said Ifeoma must have hidden it to escape the fire test. Ifeoma answered, "The bowl was full when my husband sealed this door." At the return of that kinship word, Obinna looked at her, but she had spoken it as a fact, not tenderness. Beyond the yam fields, the crying dog stopped all at once. The elders ordered the remaining pot carried to the judgment ground. The same women who had eaten from Ifeoma's hand took her by both upper arms when Nneka accused her of hiding the missing portion. Her stool was pushed into the red earth. Obinna stood beside the elders and used her bare name again. Ifeoma did not struggle. She looked at the women holding her and asked, "When truth finishes speaking tonight, will these same hands remember where they placed themselves?" Nneka lifted the blackened pot. "Let the fire show us what this woman has been feeding my brother." She poured the food before the ceremonial flame while the compound watched. The telling had now returned to the wound from which it began. The fire reached for the meal, bent low, and drew away. Red dust clung to Ifeoma's wrapper. Wood smoke entered her eyes. Still, she did not bow her head. One oil lamp died, then another, though no wind crossed the courtyard. Ifeoma remained still, yet her shadow lengthened against the direction of the fire. It crossed the red earth, wrapped itself around Obinna's ankles and held fast. Behind him, a second darkness rose where no person stood, taller than the compound gate. Nneka shouted that the shadow had revealed its owner. Papa Chidi struck his staff once. "Do not name a snake before you see which way its head is facing." The darkness reached for Obinna, and Ifeoma's shadow dragged him beyond its hand. The elders formed a tighter judgment circle as the ceremonial flame began to shrink. One elder said a guilty shadow would have reached for Obinna's throat, not pulled him away from danger. Nneka answered that poison could pretend to heal before it killed. Obinna could not step beyond the shadow holding his feet. Let the village square hear you now. Write your country beside the name you blame most for what was done to Ifeoma. Papa Chidi then called Ada into the circle. Ada came forward with both hands pressed against her ochre dress. Papa Chidi asked her to sing the words Mama Amara had forbidden. The child looked at Ifeoma and began softly. Eat before the fuya sleeps. Let the faithful shadow stand. Before she reached the final word, Obinna spoke it with her. His own voice startled him. The scar in his palm opened into a complete dark circle, and his knees weakened. He smelled bitter smoke, though the wind carried the ceremonial fire away from him. The courtyard disappeared from Obinna's eyes. He saw himself as an infant on a woven mat inside the old grove. Mama Amara knelt beside him, younger but unmistakable, begging the darkness not to take her only son. A woman's shadow stood over the mat, while a voice spoke of a faithful wife who would one day carry the postponed life. Obinna returned, gasping. He looked at Ifeoma as if seeing 7 harvests for the first time. "The song," he whispered. "I knew it before I knew you." Papa Chidi turned to Mama Amara. "A mother who borrows tomorrow's shadow must answer when tomorrow comes looking for it." He asked her to kneel before the fire and swear that she had never offered another woman's shadow for Obinna's life. Mama Amara opened her mouth. No sound came. She tried again, gripping her wrapper until her knuckles lightened. Her throat closed around the oath. On the kola tray, one nut split into the same 4 crooked pieces that appeared when she first lied about the leaves. Ada ran to Mama Amara's room and returned with the old indigo cloth. Its circular burn mark matched the shape in Obinna's palm. Papa Chidi recognized it only after the oath had failed. He told the elders he had stood inside the old grove 35 harvests earlier and heard Mama Amara accept the covenant. The cloth confirmed his memory, but it did not force the truth. Mama Amara bent forward and confessed that Ifeoma had inherited the price of a promise she had never made. The ceremonial flame fell lower. Pa Chidi said one missed meal could not have awakened the covenant fully. Someone had broken the final portion and helped reject its guardian before witnesses. Nneka looked towards the ash path, then confessed that she had poured Obinna's food into cold ash to prove Ifeoma was controlling him. "I was saving my brother," Pa Chidi answered. The goat that breaks another goat's tether should first ask what was being held back. Ada named the ash on Nneka's sandals. Obinna stepped away from his sister. The second darkness pressed closer, and Ifeoma's shadow tightened around Obinna's feet. Papa Chidi told her she could prepare another meal and renew the protection. Ifeoma did not move. She looked at Mama Amara. "What will it cost me?" The older woman tried to answer with tears. Ifeoma stopped her. "No, Mama Amara. Tears are not terms. Say the price with the same mouth that hid it." Around them, the ceremonial flames sank until only 3 strong tongues remained, and every witness leaned forward because the next truth would decide whose life the fire intended to keep. Mama Amara raised her face before the elders. If the guardian is rejected before witnesses and her final harvest meal is deliberately broken, the postponed life will return before the ceremonial fire dies. If she renews the protection while the first promise remains hidden, her shadow will belong to the protected man until her own last fire. The compound heard the consequence. Ifeoma's shadow was not merely protecting Obinna. Another willing meal, prepared while secrecy still covered the first promise, would bind part of her life to him permanently. Obinna stepped back from the price his mother had hidden. Ifeoma turned towards Obinna. Her grandmother had recognized the scar in his palm before the marriage and taught her the leaves, roasted seed and water drawn before first cockcrow. She had entered the Okafor household knowing that danger followed him, but believing trust would grow before the final harvest. For 7 harvests she watched his breathing, guarded the evening fire, and carried the fear alone. "I was ready to tell you when your love became stronger than your fear," she said. "Tonight your fear spoke first, and it spoke loudly enough for the whole compound to hear." Obinna reached towards her, but Ifeoma stepped beyond his hand. She would not renew the covenant under the same silence that had made her useful and disposable at once. "You removed my stool before truth arrived. You called me by my bare name before people who ate from my pot. Now the fire is asking for my shadow, and all of you are looking at me as if sacrifice is obedience." No elder interrupted her. Share this telling with one person who has ever been punished for protecting people who would not defend them when accusing voices became loud. Papa Chidi planted his staff beside the fire. "There is another path." Then he gave the escape clause as he had heard it in the old grove. The first mouth must confess what it promised. The protected man must choose without another mouth answering for him. The guardian must act freely. When truth, choice, and willing mercy stand together before the fire may take the hidden promise and leave both lives untouched. Nneka opened her mouth. Papa Chidi silenced her with one look. Obinna's choice could not borrow his sister's voice, his mother's fear, or elder command. Obinna looked first at Nneka, then at Amara. Both women had spoken for him until he no longer knew which fear belonged to him. He stepped away from them and entered the open center alone. The second darkness leaned closer. Ifeoma's shadow strained around his ankles like a rope pulled against floodwater. Obinna removed the leather cord from his wrist, placed it on the red earth and said, "No sister, no mother, no elder will answer for me now." The compound became quiet enough to hear the ceremonial wood settle and one coal break inside the shrinking flame. Obinna knelt before Ifeoma. He did not reach for her wrapper or ask her to lift him. "My wife," he said, and the kinship word returned before every witness who had watched him remove it. "Fear did not take your stool. I did. Fear did not call you by your bare name. I did. My family gave me suspicion, but I chose what to do with it." He asked her to save him only if the act would also free her. His apology did not demand forgiveness, and that was the first honest thing it carried to the circle. Ifeoma looked at the man kneeling before her, then at the women who had held her arms. "A public wound cannot be covered with a private apology," she said. Obinna bowed his head. Papa Chidi asked whether she would act freely. Ifeoma walked to the fallen wooden ladle, lifted it from the dust, and held it across both palms. "I will prepare one final meal, not because this compound owns my hands, not because marriage owns my shadow. I will do it because the choice is mine, and tonight the choice will remain mine before all who denied it." Ada carried water from the clay jar while Ifeoma entered the reopened cooking shelter. This time the child crossed the threshold without stumbling. Ifeoma washed the wooden ladle, placed bitter leaves on the preparation board, and crushed them with roasted seed. The compound watched from beyond the shelter boundary. Nobody entered without calling. Nobody touched her ingredients. Obinna remained beside the fire, and the second darkness bent over him. Ifeoma poured water into the pot and said, "What was done in secrecy will not be repaired in secrecy." Even Nneka remained outside the place she had entered without permission. Amara stood before the elders and confessed the first promise. When the protected son takes a wife, the willing shadow of a faithful woman may stand between him and the life that was postponed. During every harvest season, he must eat from her willing hand before the evening fire sleeps. She admitted accepting those terms when Obinna was an infant and hiding them for 35 harvests. Then she turned towards Ifeoma. "My wife, I gave your tomorrow away before I knew your face." Ifeoma did not answer her or restore the word mahma to her mouth. The final portion was poured into the ceremonial bowl. Ifeoma carried it from the shelter herself. Obinna rose from his knees, but did not take the bowl until she stood before him. He received it with both hands, as one receives what must not be treated casually. The circular mark in his palm darkened against the clay. Amara continued her confession, naming Nneka's interruption, her own lies, and the cost that had fallen on Ifeoma. The first mouth had spoken. The protected man had chosen. Only willing mercy remained, and none dared command the hand carrying it. Ada moved beside Ifeoma and sang, "Eat be, for the fire sleeps, let the faithful shadow stand." The refrain crossed the courtyard without fear, stopping it. Obinna lifted the bowl. The second darkness reached over his shoulder as the ceremonial flame sank towards its final ember. He ate one mouthful, then another. Ifeoma kept one hand beneath the bowl but did not feed him like a child. He finished the final spoonful from her willing hand. The scar in his palm opened with heat. Every judgment lamp went dark, and the old grove answered with a cracking branch. For one breath, the compound belonged only to fire and shadow. The second darkness wrapped an arm around Obinna's chest. Ifeoma's shadow rose from the earth, taller than her body, and stood between them. The darkness pulled. The guardian shadow held. Ifeoma's knees bent, but she did not fall. Obinna reached towards her and stopped before touching her, remembering that choice still belonged to her. "Release what is mine," Ifeoma said. The words were not spoken to Obinna. They were spoken to the promise that had mistaken her mercy for ownership and her silence for permanent consent. The guardian shadow turned away from Obinna. It crossed the red earth, joined Ifeoma's feet, and became her natural shape again. The second darkness gave one sound like wet wood splitting and entered the ceremonial fire. The old indigo covenant cloth lifted from Ada's hands, crossed the circle, and burned without touching another object. Flame rose above the compound wall, then settled into clean amber light. Obinna remained standing. Ifeoma looked down and moved one foot. Her shadow moved with her, neither late nor borrowed, while the circular mark in Obinna's palm faded to its old thin scar. Nobody celebrated. The elders remained seated until the final ember cooled, because survival had not yet answered the wrong committed before witnesses. Nneka stood apart from Obinna. Amara returned the wooden ladle to the edge of Ifeoma's shelter, but did not enter. The women who had restrained Ifeoma lowered their arms and looked towards the ground. Papa Chidi ordered every witness to return at first light, when the compound would restore what it had taken and name what could not be restored by decree. Ifeoma sat alone beside her pot until the first cockcrow crossed the fields. At first light, the elders cleared Ifeoma's name, restored her stool and harvest share, and removed Nneka from the family store. A stool returned after daylight still remembers who threw it into the dust, one elder said. Obinna asked Ifeoma to remain. She gathered her wrappers and food. Surviving the night does not settle what you did in daylight. He did not block the gate. The women who held her never apologized. Ifeoma walked towards her grandmother's compound with her shadow beside her. Was Obinna only a frightened husband, or the man who betrayed the woman who saved him?